Hello everyone, and welcome to our provocatively titled debate, Are Arbitrators Getting Away with Too Much? A member-hosted event forming an official part of London International Disputes Week 2021. I'd like to thank LIDW's sponsor, the IDRC, for presenting today's event. We are very grateful to Damien Hickman and the rest of the team for all their assistance. And of course, thank you to all sponsors of LIDW, including Platinum sponsor FTI Consulting. I'm Barry Fletcher, Head of Arbitration at LexisNexis in the UK, and it is my privilege to moderate today's debate. I have to say you are in for a real treat. And so to our debaters, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Philippa Charles, Partner and Head of International Arbitration at Stewarts, Jean-François Le Gal, International Arbitration Partner at Pinsent Masons, Poonam Melwani QC, a commercial silk at Quadrant Chambers, and Hendrik Puschmann, Partner at Fire & Co. and co-chair of the firm's arbitration group. It has been a lot of fun and a pleasure working with this team, and I'd like to thank them for taking the time to prepare so well for today. Okay, so before we start the debate, I just want to give a brief context. So our speakers will, I'm sure, elicit nods of fierce approval and raise eyebrows from you, the audience, against the backdrop of the Arbitration Act 1996 and the curial oversight of the English and Welsh courts. The Act provides for limited judicial review of awards at the enforcement stage and during standalone set-aside proceedings, as well as offering narrow opportunities to challenge arbitrators themselves. For the benefit of those less familiar with the relevant sections of the Act, and we have an international audience today, awards issued in proceedings seated in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland can be challenged, appealed before the court under three gateways. The first is Section 67, a mandatory provision allowing the court to vary or set aside awards on the basis that the tribunal lacked the necessary substantive jurisdiction. At typically quite significant cost, Section 67 applications involve a full rehearing by the court of the maligned decision. The second gateway is Section 68, again mandatory, which provides for challenges to awards on the ground that there has been a serious irregularity, which has caused or will cause substantial injustice to the applicant. Section 68 has been described as a remedy for extreme cases where something has gone badly wrong with the fairness of the proceedings. While that high threshold doesn't stop hopeless applications coming to court, there is also an argument that the bar has been raised too high for success. Finally, Section 69. This section permits appeals on questions of English law arising out of awards. This is a gateway that, as Mr. Justice Coleman once remarked, gets some practitioners, but by no means all, quite hot under the collar. Such appeals can be brought either with all-party agreement or more commonly with the court's permission. And like Section 67 and Section 68, it is possible for parties to contract out of the operation of this section, which they are taken to have done when, for example, they have agreed to the application of the LCIA or ICC arbitration rules, but not, for example, when they agree to the application of the LMA terms, unless they also agree to dispense with reasons. In a 2001 article, Why Courts Review Arbitral Awards, Professor Rusty Park stated that efficient arbitration implicates a tension between the rival goals of finality and fairness. On the one hand, shielding arbitral awards from judicial challenge promotes finality, and I'd add, confidentiality, but on the other, enhancing fairness calls for at least some measure of court supervision of the arbitral process. What this debate will show, in addition to just how entertaining our speakers can be, is that what amounts to the right balance between finality and fairness is fertile ground for holding a variety of opinions. So, Hendrik and Poonam will be arguing for the proposition that arbitrators are getting away with far too much and won't be holding back. Philippa and Jean-François will argue in defense of the proposition and similarly will not be pulling any punches in support of arbitrators. Both sides will present their main arguments first and will then have a chance to reply to what they have heard. Brief replies. After all that, I will put some questions and comments to our speakers. So to our audience, if you could please use the Q&A functionality, then I'll keep an eye on that as we go along, and we'll try to get as many of those to our speakers at the end of towards the end of the session. You will also have a chance, as a little bit of extra fun on a Wednesday, to vote on which team carry the day. And we'll do that, obviously, after you've heard the various arguments. So, without further ado, let's hear from our speakers. And first up, arguing for the proposition is Hendrik and Poonam.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much, everybody, for giving up your Wednesday morning for this sort of thing. I'll be arguing for the proposition, although if you've come here for a measured, detailed argument on the ambit of Section 67, 68, 69 of the Arbitration Act, then I suggest that you switch off now, because what this basically is a rant, okay, which I have practiced fulsomely down the pub on many occasions, because I feel, and it is, and I'll explain later why, a feeling rather than something for which I have empirical evidence. I feel, A, in arbitration, we have a quality problem that we're not addressing, and B, we're not addressing it, at least in part, because we have a self-perception problem, because the arbitration community, quote unquote, lives in this big bubble, okay, where we keep telling each other that everything is hunky-dory. Now, there couldn't be a proper debate, even if I had all sorts of evidence and measured arguments to make, because what we're talking about here is the holy cow, ultimately, of the finality of arbitration awards. This is a dogma, okay? We're talking stone tablets here. It is a quasi-religious dogma that the finality of arbitral awards is the be-all and end-all, and that the extremely limited curial supervision of the courts must be as strictly limited by comparison to litigation as it is forever and ever. Amen. Usefully here, perhaps from political science, we can look at the concept of the Overton window, which is a concept for the window of what can and can't be debated. And things, concepts, discourses that fall outside the Overton window simply can't be debated. It's not in the frame of reference of anybody. And in arbitration, the finality of arbitral awards, and that is a good and imperative thing, is very much outside our Overton window. Lord Thomas, the outgoing Chief Justice, saw that a few years ago when very gently, much more gently than I will this morning, he queried whether really arbitration should have as limited oversight as it has and draw as many cases away from public courts as it does, and was basically shouted down. The proper debate of his proposition was really non-existent. Nobody spoke in support of what he had to say, right? And so there can't be a debate because we're not really capable of talking about it. Once again, it's a dogma. Now, why do I think we have a quality problem? First of all, as I said, it is impossible to actually give you figures here, because arbitration being arbitration, there are no figures. There is no proper reliable empirical evidence. But if I look at the whole of arbitration, of what I have done in 12 years and what I know about, my proposition is this: I am genuinely convinced that on the whole, you get better, more reliable and quicker service in a Wiltshire County Court than you get in arbitration. In arbitration, there is just too much sloppiness. There are lazy arbitrators, there are bad arbitrators, there are arbitrators that are wrong in their decisions, and there are arbitrators, and this is one big thing, that are simply cowed by parties employing vexatious delaying tactics, don't bang on the table as any self-respecting judge would. Now, of course, this is something controversial to say, and I'm saying it specifically with all of arbitration in mind, including the myriad smaller ad hoc arbitrations, which aren't captured in what we normally do, sort of high end. I am not saying that there aren't, on the whole, brilliant arbitrators who are properly committed to serving. And if I go to Philippa and to Jean-François, I can be sure that I get reliable, good, and non-cowardly service, not cowing before the parties. But there is too much of a dark underbelly that we at the high end simply don't see, where too much goes wrong. Okay, I've had an arbitrator taking nearly 2 years to come to an award. No judge would get away with that. I've had an arbitrator deciding a non-English law and therefore non-appealable point of view so wrongly that it upended the entire case. And I've had, and this annoyed me most, I've had a tribunal so cowed by one party's delaying tactics that they allowed a case to drag on for 4 years that was worth approximately $500,000 until it got to a hearing. Okay, not always, but too often there are quality issues. And because we have no curial supervision, we don't really have the means of addressing those. Okay, and this, by the way, is not just the sort of small arbitrations that I mentioned. If I had a tenner for every arbitrator with plenty of letters after their names from the bar, feeling too highfalutin, okay, too grand to properly engage with disclosure and to properly issue nuanced and detailed directions on disclosure. If I had a tenner for every time that happened, I might be able to retire now. Okay. So why don't we have a discussion then about whether or not Section 69 should be extended to cover applications for appeal against on non-English law points? For example, why shouldn't we have a discussion about whether or not we should have a mechanism for getting rid of bad arbitrators, even if they're not biased? And the Halliburton decision recently showed just how toothless the bias test is, or if they don't fulfill the basic criteria, like speaking English for an arbitrator, which are the only ways of getting rid of an arbitrator. Why don't we have that? Well, first of all, as I said, it's a perception problem. And this is really my beef. It's a problem of this overweening sense of self-importance and lacking sense of reality that I feel as an arbitration, quote, community, unquote. And by the way, it's interesting that we use this term without any apparent sense of its massive level of irony. The arbitration community has a perception problem. We, as full-time arbitration people, run around the conference circus year after year, patting each other on the back and fundamentally, paying lip service to, oh, what can we do to improve quality and improve justice? But fundamentally reassuring one another that everything is wonderful, that we're the elite of lawyers, that we're a sui generis different branch of law, and that, arbitration is the best thing since sliced bread. Okay? And so we live in a bubble and we hear only what is echoed in the bubble, which is fundamentally everything is great. Now, in terms of more substantive reasons of why we don't talk about finality, I realize I'm overrunning slightly by comparison to the practice, and I'm going to ignore Barry up until he cuts me off, and I'm not sure he knows how. So, slightly more briefly, what are the substantive arguments here of why people say, specifically, finality has to remain in place? One is party choice. Parties choose this system, and therefore, they choose a completely different system from litigation, and therefore, this is part and parcel of it. Wrong. Most of the time, parties have to choose arbitration because in an international context, that's the limiting factor. The limiting factor is enforceability. Sometimes the limiting factor is you need a specialist, say a construction or shipping person. You might not get in court to that degree. But fundamentally, they don't care if it's litigation without gowns and wigs, which most of the time, frankly, it is. And they don't want to know about the specifics of arbitration, the bells and whistles. The only people who care about that, the sort of genuinely global character of arbitration, are the arbitration lawyers. And that is why, for example, the only data we have, the big data, the quasi-canonical Queen Mary survey, keeps telling us that finality is so important, because that's filled out by the arbitration lawyers who advise people, who advise the parties who couldn't care less, other than for enforceability in most cases, to go to arbitration. By the same token, speed. I'll be two more minutes, and I apologize, and I'll buy you many drinks. I'm sorry, but 2 more points. One, Philippa and Jean-François might tell you arbitration is quicker. No, it isn't. If you take the English courts as the baseline, no self-respecting person can tell me that the more fulsome curial oversight leads to delays on the whole. And finally, and this is my last point, self-regulation. everybody says we as the community can regulate ourselves. That's true to some extent of arbitrators have made great strides at providing proper oversight of making sure arbitrators are not just selected properly, but do their job. Okay, but it's completely untrue of ad hoc arbitrations, for example. And again, self-perception here is miles away from reality. As an example, we'll take arbitrator intelligence, this great new tool, allegedly, that will allow us to assess arbitrators. It's basically TripAdvisor for arbitrators, run as a commercial for-profit enterprise. The notion that will be an effective and objective tool for ensuring quality of arbitrators is just preposterous. And so I'll finish before Barry, who is stronger and fitter than me, actually does something physical, by saying part of what I suspect to be the quality problem, maybe part of why arbitration is, and again, let's take a look at ourselves and be frank, gets a bad press beyond the arbitration press, because when it does get press, it's rarely good. Finally, therefore, I'm hoping here not so much to win a debate as to start a debate about whether it has to be a religious doctrine that finality in its current form has to remain in place forever and ever. And I'll hand over to Poonam with profuse apologies for talking over time. It was sort of inevitable, but I am nevertheless sorry.
Poonam.
Thank you, Hendrik. I'm quite exhausted. I needed a pint with that, but thank you. And look, as an advocate, you often have to argue the terrible, the impossible. And it's a joy when you're on the right side of the debate, like today. And I commend the proposition to you as plainly correct. Look, of course, not all arbitrators are getting away with too much, and many are superb. But I agree with Hendrik that there is far too much going wrong. And what's the cause of the problem? Is it, for example, greedy arbitrators taking on far too much work? Widespread terrible arbitrators? Actually, I think the root cause is more fundamental, and that it's the cardinal principles that the arbitration community hold so dear that's the problem, namely the holy grail of confidentiality and finality. I'm going to come to that in a minute, but let me just deal with one discrete issue first, namely equality, diversity. Across the commercial and the legal world, great strides are being made to improve gender equality, racial equality, etc., and the arbitration world is no exception. And certainly on gender, the situation is much improved. But let's be clear from where we started. The situation, say, 30 years ago was pretty damn bleak. I say 30 years ago because that's when I started in practice. And this is a true story. About a year and a half into my practice, I told my clerks that I would not do any more arbitration work, that I would only do court work. I said that because I felt that I was doing a disservice to my clients in arbitration. My perception was that I was not being taken as seriously as a woman in arbitrations. That was not something I felt in court at all, but it was something about the increased informality in arbitrations that somehow facilitated some arbitrators to display condescension and sexism. My self-imposed strike on arbitration had to come to an end. I mean, I did have to earn a living. And the accrual of grey hair, wrinkles, and a bit of a battle axe image has meant that I have stopped suffering from those matters. But they are not eradicated, let's be clear. And I know that from speaking to too many female barristers and solicitors. And what I would want to say here is I need the arbitrators, the parties, the community to continue to be live to the issues and to please call them out. But let's talk about more fun things. It's a Wednesday morning and we all like a gossip. So let me tell you two stories. First, the story of an arbitration where the chairman and one of the party-appointed arbitrators started with a mutual dislike, which increased day by day through the lengthy hearing, a dislike that could be measured by the increasing height of the stowaway barrier that they created between them so that they couldn't look at each other, and a dislike which culminated with the chairman commencing the arbitration one day with glee in the absence of that other arbitrator who was delayed by bad weather. And the parties? Oh, they sat there, uncomplaining, fearful of annoying the two who were there. And how about this one? We all know how rare successful 68 challenges are. So imagine this, a successful 68, where the tribunal is told by the court that they have been guilty of a serious irregularity because they failed to deal with an issue that was before them, with the matter being remitted to them. Not chagrined by this, the tribunal demanded a 6-figure sum on account before they would correct their own error. And you're all sitting there going, goodness, come on, Poonam, tell me who all these arbitrators were so I make sure I don't instruct them. Sorry, guys, can't tell you. It's all confidential. Whoops. And then there is the problem of finality. Arbitrators, institutions will tell you with pride that the number of successful 68 and 69 applications are tiny. And they trumpet this as proof that the arbitrators are excellent. And the numbers are startlingly low. I've done some research. 2018, 2019, there were only 39 Section 69 applications, and they all failed. In 2019-20, only 26 challenges were made under Section 68, with only one being successful. These are astonishingly low numbers. So is it proof that the arbitrators are getting it right and doing it right? Hardly. Let's remember how the DAC described the Section 68 jurisdiction, which is how the courts apply it. They said, and I quote, "It's only in those cases where it can be said that what has happened is so far removed from what could reasonably be expected that we would expect the court to take action. The parties have agreed to arbitrate, not litigate. Having chosen arbitration, they cannot complain unless what has happened cannot be defended as an acceptable consequence of the choice to arbitrate." So the ethos is you can't complain unless what has happened is extreme, that on no view can it be defended. Really? Are the parties really aware of this? Are they told this when they choose arbitration clauses for their contracts or when they agree to ad hoc arbitrations? And is this finality really what commercial parties want as the price for speed? Sorry, is this lack of appellate process really an applicable price to pay for the finality they say they need? And just coming to my last point, there is the problem of partisanship. The very confused and differing views in international arbitration about the role and the expectations of the party-appointed arbitrator. There was a lot of discussion about this in Halliburton and Chubb, and this is what the Supreme Court said. They said some, maybe many parties, and some, maybe many arbitrators in international arbitrations have an understanding or expectation that the party-appointed arbitrator should be predisposed towards that party. And they concluded there was an ongoing debate within the international world as to the precise role of the party-appointed arbitrator and how that works with the need to be lacking in bias. I really struggle with how this debate can be allowed to continue. How can there be confusion about this fundamental issue? I understand that one may choose an arbitrator because one perceives that he has an understanding of a particular business or an understanding of geographical or cultural issues and so on. But that's not the same as a predisposition. In my opinion, a predisposition, any expectation that a party-appointed arbitrator is on your side should be brought to an end. But wherever you are on that debate, it shouldn't be a debate. We need to have clarity and resolution and rules about this. So in conclusion, we have confusion on the issue of partisanship and the murky line between that and bias. We have confidentiality masking failings, and we have finality precluding scrutiny. I commend the proposition arbitrators are getting away with too much. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Poonam and Hendrik, although minus points, Hendrik, for going over time. Now to the other side of the debate. We'll not waste any time. And Philippa and Jean-François, you are up.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, everybody. Good morning. I'd like to think that I have a balanced or perhaps Janus-faced approach to these matters as a practitioner and more recently as an arbitrator. I can't imagine the organisers of this week's activities running a panel on, is the judiciary running amok? But here we are, being asked to defend the indefensible in the persona of the under-regulated arbitrator. There is a lot with which I agree in what Hendrik and Poonam have raised, but I think it's an error to lay the blame for these matters at the door of the arbitrators as a general rule. Though I'm sorry they both seem to have had such bad experiences with their arbitrators. The issue of selection of the tribunal is the obvious starting point for rebuttal of the premise that arbitrators are getting away with reprehensible conduct. Jean-François is going to speak more on the topic of arbitrator selection. Should we all be in favour of choosing better arbitrators? Absolutely. However, I think the critique of arbitrators or the suggestion that a more extensive review process would change things very much is misplaced for the following 7 reasons. First, a lazy arbitrator who drafts poorly is not the same thing as an appealable arbitrator. How would an expanded range of options for appeal assist unless, say, a statutory time limit for the production of awards was introduced? Could that be in the parties' interests in complex cases? I don't think so. Second, the bad arbitrator problem is a lot less widespread than the gossip would suggest is the case. We all love a war story, but how many have been cited so far today by practitioners with many years of combined experience? About 5. Boringly, the vast majority of arbitrations are well managed and result in carefully written awards which are right on the law. By and large, in my experience, complaints about arbitrators' behaviour are only ever made by the unsuccessful party. And given the degree of ego at the arbitration bar, isn't it more tempting to blame a loss on the defective arbitrator than on the defective case or client? I think far too much store is set in anecdotal trivia and animus than is helpful to confidence in the system. And I think the statistics that Poonam has cited demonstrate perfectly accurately that not very much is going wrong with the system. Third, far from reassuring each other that everything's fine, most conferences and most institutions put in a vast degree of soul searching about arbitrator behaviour and conduct and characteristics than is the case in litigation conferences, where people moan endlessly about the CPR and its revisions and the weight of the white book, but regard themselves as stuck with the need to comply with them. In arbitration, it seems to me that the breadth of discretion and the broad guidance on conduct of proceedings causes arbitrators plenty of sleepless nights. They get little credit for the respect they pay to the responsibility which they have to exercise with little or no strict guidance other than the ideals of a fair process and reasonable expedition in the circumstances of the particular case. Fourth, procedural unfairness is, in my view, rightly a restrictive category of challenge. Most cases are decided on the law and on the evidence and fall within the range of reasonable outcomes which the tribunal could have reached. Absent some really striking departure from the norms of a fair process, then as odd or as unwelcome as an interim or procedural decision may be, there is nothing to prevent them, and nor, in my view, should there be. That is part of the bargain the parties have struck when agreeing to arbitrate. Party autonomy really matters here, and I don't think it's right to assume that parties don't know what they're signing up for when they choose arbitration. The balancing between confidentiality, speed, and finality, and the loss of the ability automatically or semi-automatically to appeal is something which I think most commercial parties, at least, do understand what they're getting into. And I include in that those parties who enter into ad hoc, smaller value proceedings. Fifth, I think it's important to say a word or two about the 3-person tribunal. Where a 3-member tribunal is late or unavailable or appears not to have taken matters on board in the award, it's very difficult indeed to work out which member or members may lie at the root of the problem, which is why I think naming and shaming is a bad route to weed out those arbitrators who aren't doing their job correctly. Arbitrators are human, and they may be derailed in their conduct of a case by illness or family problems or competing demands on their time, particularly if they are also practitioners. Though I suppose the question of how many hats we should wear is another vexed one and probably outside the scope of this debate today. Ask yourself as a practitioner or in the shoes of your client what you would prefer: an award prepared in haste by an underslept and pressured tribunal, or an award which has been prepared with the benefit of thorough reflection and review of all the relevant materials. A slow award is not necessarily a bad award, although I accept that in extreme cases, delay can reach a threshold of procedural unfairness. But I prefer to think of this in terms of the tortoise and the hare. Sixth, I think it's important to distinguish flaws of character from flaws in performance. The purpose of an appeal is to right a wrong against the parties which leads to substantial injustice, whether or not under the narrower provisions of the 1996 Act or the broader basis permitted for court cases. How many of the issues that Poonam and Hendrik have raised are properly matters which would lead to a successful appeal? If you make arbitration a multilateral process with a wider or more open appeal mechanism, you inevitably increase the time and cost of the process overall. Is that really in the parties' interests? Moreover, you subtract from arbitration its differentiation from litigation. Do we really want a blue book for arbitration in 3 volumes sitting alongside the white and green books? I know I don't. Seventh, the institutions have an oversight on arbitrator performance, and Jean-François will speak to the advantages of that process. However, if we were to allow the institutions to select only those arbitrators who pass their exacting standards perfectly, we would be doomed to continue a cycle in which efforts to diversify the pool of arbitrators are strangled at birth, given that I suspect one of the first parameters applying to a list system would be that the arbitrators on it have previously served successfully as arbitrator under the rules of that institution. Ultimately, arbitration is not a formulaic process, but one in which the parties and their counsel have far greater agency than in the national courts. We should be embracing that agency rather than declaring ourselves the victim of it and seeking to undermine its efficacy by giving ourselves wider opportunities to attack the decision makers who are doing, in the main, a very good job. So I reject the proposition and hand over to Jean-François.
Well, thank you very much, Philippa. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say that my heart bleeds when I hear all those spurious attacks against all those poor and innocent arbitrators, a number of whom I know attend this webinar. I mean, they must be heartbroken by now. But, well, as we say in English, honi soit qui mal y pense. So, most of the groundless criticisms expressed earlier have already been wonderfully addressed by Philippa, and therefore I would just add a few words. Starting with the so-called lack of diversity. Well, we almost have gender equality around this virtual table, and we also have several nationalities, including, I think, a German citizen and a French citizen. So how is that for diversity? Have you heard many German or French lawyers plead at the county court in Wiltshire? Well, I'm sure I haven't. How many German or French QCs do we know of? A handful at best. And this is only one tiny example amongst many other initiatives which are being taken within the arbitration community. Can someone point me to the equivalent of the Arab Pledge or the African Promise outside the arbitration landscape? And now a few stats, because as arbitration practitioners, we do love stats. I mean, if you look at the stats of the LCA, just to give one example, the LCA appointed 43% female arbitrators in 2018, and this figure even increased to 48% in 2019. So yes, of course, there is still a lot which needs to be done. But first, arbitral institutions do their bit. And second, as rightly pointed out by Philippa earlier, who is actually responsible for this alleged lack of diversity? I mean, who selects arbitrators most of the time? These are the counsel. So they are the ones to be blamed, not the arbitrators themselves. Now, insularity, I heard a lot about this myth of the club, this echo chamber, etc. Well, you only need to get a subscription to Zoom to enter the club these days, really. And when pandemic ends and when in-person conferences are back on, well, you just need to love champagne and canapes again, and free of charge most of the time. So I think I've seen far less welcoming clubs. And as a matter of fact, the arbitration community is perhaps the only non-members club I know of, which is open to anyone, anywhere in the world. But now, I'd like to move on to the more technical arguments which were raised earlier. I heard about the alleged lack of a proper right to appeal. And I was slightly surprised by that argument in a way, because as we all know, arbitration is consensual. So you have actually every opportunity to draft your arbitration clause the way you want. and craft an appeal process if and as you wish. So, and you can even agree to that after the dispute has started, which means after you had read of those indoctrinated lawyers, which Hendrik referred to earlier. And in addition, if you think about it, a consensually agreed appeal or second stage process within the arbitral process just means more work for the arbitrators. So do you really think they're going to object to that? So my suggestion is, Hendrik, please just suggest a model arbitration clause, providing for a carefully crafted appeal process. And I'm sure this can become the topic of the next round of arbitration conferences. So we have the red fund schedule. We'll now have the Puschmann clause. Now, quality of awards. I heard all those complaints about correctness, lack of quality, etc. And much has been said already. So I would just highlight that arbitral institutions have built-in processes in that regard. And I would just name one, the ICC award scrutiny. I mean, under this process, as we all know, every tribunal must submit their draft award for review by the court before the award can be issued. And we also know, if you read the guide of the ICC Secretariat, that the review is quite broad. It can be far-reaching remarks that, I quote, may sometimes require the entire award or at least sections of the award to be redrafted. I mean, what judge would accept to see his or her draft judgment scrutinized by an army of his or her most eminent peers? Not many, I submit. Procrastination, delays, the lack of speed. Well, again, I thought it was maybe due to Hendrik's great sense of humor, because at the end of the day, again, who is to blame for those delays? I mean, they are the counsel, of course. We know who the villains are here. They are the counsel, not those poor and innocent arbitrators. To give one example, in my first case as chair of the tribunal, one of the counsel objected to the tribunal setting a pre-hearing conference because he said, and I quote, "It's contrary to my legal tradition." And on the top of that, if you think about it as well anyway, many arbitral institutions have sought to tackle this issue and now provide for expedited and or emergency measures, procedures. The LCIA, again, just to give just one example about the early determination of some of the claims. And more generally anyway, there is far more flexibility in arbitration to allow parties to make preliminary issue applications and to have this dealt with fairly quickly. I mean, as a matter of fact, over the past few years, whether as counsel or as an arbitrator, I've seen quite a number of applications for bifurcation of proceedings and or requests for partial awards. Lastly, on delays, if you think about it again, you can see that institutions have decided sometimes to just reduce the arbitrators' fees if they are late in issuing their awards. And money being what it is, I can safely bet that this is quite an efficient measure. Now, moving to the next topic, the so-called lack of self-regulation, and which would be due to confidentiality. I heard Poonam saying something along the lines of, I can't tell you who it was that was bad because it's confidential. Really? I mean, who can seriously argue that a bad arbitrator can escape popular vindictiveness at the edge of GAR, kind of the Vanity Fair of international arbitration? I mean, even parties to proceedings sometimes discover things about their case when they read GAR. So not so much about confidentiality in a way. In addition, an arbitrator we know is up for scapegoating if set-aside proceedings are launched against his or her will. I mean, everything will be public. Poor fellow. Now, I'm moving on and getting close to my conclusion, but I haven't talking about what I heard, but I want to say a few words about what I haven't heard about. I haven't heard so much about the alternative. I mean, I almost thought I was attending a French political debate earlier, because all was about criticizing what exists without even thinking about what would be the alternative. And actually, if you think about it, what is the alternative here? It can be a system where the judge will not bother to hear you for more than 20 minutes, and that's if you're lucky, even if it's a multi-million claim, and even if you had to wait 2 to 3 years to get to hearing. And that's the case in most civil law jurisdictions. And I'm talking from experience, having started my career as a litigator in France. Or it can be a system where you have to show absolute deference to your judge for fear of later being thrashed in his or her publicly available judgment, or where you have to navigate through thousands of pages containing I don't know how many procedural rules, objectives, practice directions, forms, timelines, and so on. And that's the common law system. And again, I'm talking from experience, having been mad enough to cross the channel 10 years ago and being qualified in England. So whatever its alleged flaws, the reality of it is that arbitration is at the very minimum the least bad system. And arbitrators are the officers or servants of that system. Now, to conclude, another thing I haven't heard about so much is solutions. I've heard a lot of complaints, a lot of moaning, which was quite irritating, wasn't it? But I have heard hardly any solution here. And yet, those solutions do exist. They are being suggested, they are debated, and they can be found. I mean, in relation to each and every one of those complaints, the arbitration community is a 24/7 global think tank with the best practitioners from all over the world, always keen to suggest practical solutions. Not least to get those solutions named after them, but that's another story. So I'll just give a few examples to conclude. We know that the idea was raised by some that the appointment of arbitrators should be left to institutions. Philippa made the point that this might lead to the risk of those institutions appointing always the same people. And Philippa is part of my team, so she's necessarily right. But that being said, I would be slightly less concerned by that, because at the end of the day, arbitral institutions can be encouraged to have a policy, for example, of appointing arbitrators they have never appointed before for cases below a certain value or for cases meeting certain criteria. You can also expand the use of arbitrators' feedback forms to be filled in by parties and counsel. You can extend the use of the scrutiny process by the institutions, which I was referring earlier. And you can also think about the optional appeal stage within the arbitral process, which I referred to earlier. So yes, there are issues, but yes, there are solutions. And no, of course, no, arbitrators are not getting away with too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippa and Jean-François. And if that hasn't enlivened our audience today, I'm not sure what will. As I'm sure you could probably tell, Hendrik and Poonam kind of visibly can't wait to respond. So both, this is your last chance to bolster your side of the debate. I would say we are running out of time, so 2.5 minutes each, and that honestly, and then we can continue beyond. But that's it, for fairness purposes, that's what we're doing. So keep it
okay,
short.
well, in that case, I'm going to go straight in because I need Poonam to be last so that she can save my bacon here, because my German bluntness might not be a match against Irish charm and biting French sarcasm. But first things first, Jean-François, I hope for your sake that Barbara Doman QC does not hear about your remark about the lack of top German QCs at the English bar. But apart from that, this was the bubble speaking. This is exactly what I mean. Poonam and I framed the debate in terms of a global problem for arbitration in England and the particular problem of ad hoc arbitration, which didn't even feature. Jean-François and Philippa automatically assumed that all arbitration would be institutional. And Jean-François and Philippa then said, okay, well, yes, but we haven't heard about anything. We don't perceive a quality problem. And arbitrators at conferences think earnestly about quality control issues. And that, again, is the bubble speaking. Yes, we think earnestly about quality control issues so that we can then convince ourselves that fundamentally the system is working. Nobody at none of these conferences asked the systemic question, and that is the solution, by the way, which was proposed, whether or not curial oversight needs to be expanded. That is simply not something that is within your frame of debate, Philippa and Jean-François. You were incapable of engaging with it. And instead, we get the classic appeal to the turkeys voting for Christmas, which is basically Jean-François saying, you can appoint me as chair because I understand your plight, arbitrators, and blacklist Hendrik. And that therein, and even if that club doesn't have formal membership requirement, in this turkeys voting for Christmas point lies one of the fundamental problems, right? And so you can't just go and give speech bubbles from the bubble of this is a 24/7 global think tank with the best arbitration lawyers, which is wonderful, when any solution, even if a problem is acknowledged, any solution will revolve around those practitioners. And nobody asks the question whether that system can remain to be self-contained. With that, I'll hand over to Poonam for a more worthy rebuttal.
Thanks, Hendrik. Jean-François, I think I made it clear that the issue of diversity has much improved, but I do think to use the makeup of this panel as a proof of the pudding, we all know that these panels are handpicked to show diversity, regardless of whether that exists in the real world. I also, frankly, find it terrifying that, to use Jean-François' words, all you need to be an arbitrator is a Zoom subscription and a like of champagne and canapes. There has to be more than just those, surely. And I agree with the comments from some of the audience that, yes, selection of arbitrators is the key, knowing their quality, and therefore we need more transparency. Someone suggested a rating system, and I would commend that. But the problem is that thus far, confidentiality issues has meant that there isn't this available in any real sense. Jean-François also mentioned that you have scrutiny, and he gave the example of the ICC award system. So hang on, the parties have chosen their arbitrators. The arbitrators have heard the arguments, but somebody who hasn't heard the arguments gets to read and fiddle with the award and make all sorts of suggestions and changes. And the parties don't know who's done that, whether they've been accepted, what is actually from the arbitrators, or what's come from this third-party intervention. That doesn't strike me as a really satisfactory situation at all. It's also been said, well, if we don't like the curial law, the section 67, 68, 69 position, the parties can have their bespoke clauses. The fact that the parties could do that doesn't change and doesn't eradicate the problem of the base position being incorrect. And I would like to see a reconsideration and a review of those processes. And to this extent, I'll accept that the lawyers are at fault. When has anyone ever sat with their clients and said, I know you're agreeing to arbitration, but actually the appeal process is rubbish, so now let's add some extra twiddles. I see we are running out of time, so I will stop there and hand over to Philippa.
Thank you, Poonam, and thank you, Hendrik. Look, I think there are clearly issues in certain areas of arbitration. One of our attendees this morning has particularly strongly pointed out that there are quality control issues in their view in relation to the conduct of certain trade association arbitrations. And again, I think it's perception rather than reality because, as we pointed out earlier, the statistics on successful challenges speak for themselves. And actually, in a lot of ad hoc proceedings and in proceedings which are not excluding appeals on points of law, there are very few challenges that are brought and very few of those succeed. And so I think you have to conclude that the evidence demonstrates that actually in the vast majority of cases, things are going as they should. And I think from the perspective of, smaller enterprises, they prize the speed and the finality of the process, whether or not ultimately it's perfect. And of course, we should strive for the perfect, but we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, in my view. And I think we're at risk of doing that if we spend our time running ourselves down and describing ourselves as living in a bubble and generally behaving as though we're all somehow engaged in some sort of dirty process that, is fundamentally flawed, which is what I'm hearing from the other side. Ultimately, we have a bunch of people acting as arbitrators who are doing their best, and they are trying to balance very often the incompatible desires of the parties, one of whom wants to make things run for as long as possible, and one of whom wants a result yesterday. And, for a tribunal to try and put in place a process and a procedure that is fair to both of those parties is really hard. And I think we should give arbitrators credit for taking on that role and that responsibility and taking the risk of being challenged and potentially named and shamed and certainly gossiped about in the pub. And we should give them credit for the good that they do. Jean-François.
So I think we are running out of time, so I'll be very short, and I think everything has been said anyway. Just in relation to Hendrik's point about ad hoc arbitration and the fact that we have deliberately ignored that scope, that space landscape, I would say that, I mean, as you rightly pointed out yourself, Hendrik, I mean, it seems like a feeling, to quote you, about what's going on there. And as you said, there's no empirical evidence. So as a result, it's quite difficult to debate and just try and put some sort of a mathematical analysis in that regard, because I mean, if it's about feelings, of course, it makes things a bit more difficult. In relation to diversity, just to answer to Poonam, well, I'm not the one who set up the panel, so I guess that's probably a point to be made and to be addressed by Barry. So maybe we'd be happy to address that later. But apart from that, my point was not only in relation to our panel. I mentioned the stats from the LCA, for example, and I think that's a good example of what's going on, and other initiatives such as the ERA Pledge or the African Promise. Again, as I think we can agree that there's still a lot to be done, and we are far from getting there, but, well, efforts are being made. Thank you. Over to you, Barry.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the quick replies at the end there. So we're going to move on to comments and questions very, very shortly. But first, a quick poll to see where our audience stands. So if the IDRC could circulate that, I think you'll see it on the screen. So what do you think? Are arbitrators getting away with too much? So yes, no, or are you on the fence despite the strength of the arguments on either side?
I've just tried to vote, and I just realized that we're not allowed to vote as panelists. Yes. So I feel absolutely discriminated here.
Jean-François, were you trying to make sure there was at least one vote on your side of the fence?
So we're approaching 10 o'clock, so we've got 4 minutes. So and coming to the end of the hour that we have. So what I'd say is our speakers are happy to stick around to answer some more questions and comments beyond 10 o'clock, just for 10 minutes or so. So if you'd like to stay on the call for that, then please do. But before we look at some questions, comments, I wanted to say thank you so much to the speakers for having fun with us today, but also at the same time making some serious points for consideration within the audience and more broadly. And thank you so much to the audience for joining us in a very busy week. And thank you to the IDRC again for presenting the session today, and good luck with the exciting opening of the new facilities in due course. Thank you again to the sponsors of LIDW, including Platinum sponsor FTI Consulting. I really do hope that you've enjoyed LIDW so far, both the core conference and the member hosted events. And for those with tickets to the core conference, then there are some great sessions today, and check out the networking as well, which has been good fun. And there's a speed working session later today. So thank you. If you're leaving us now on the next couple of minutes, then thank you and have a good day. But for those of you who are still hanging around, let's pick up on some of the questions and comments. I think, as Poonam said in her reply, and I think Philippa picked up on too, party choice of arbitrators is clearly a really important consideration here. If you know arbitrators are poor, then they shouldn't be appointed in the first place, and getting as much information out there, reliable, robust information out there, might be a solution, and that's something that's come through in many of the comments. What I wanted to ask specifically was, this was an anonymous attempt from a question from an anonymous attendee. How does the proposition that arbitrators are delivering a poor service align with the year-on-year growth in the use of arbitration, illustrated by institutional and other data? Arbitration is, after all, a user-purchased service. Where service is poor or perceived to be poor, demand should drop like any other market. Does anyone who would like to take that?
Poonam, I've spoken so much. If you want to take it, then I'll happily shut up.
Well,
I can.
I suppose my reaction to that, I've been reading that and thinking about that, is, okay, so let's assume that it's correct that the arbitration numbers are going up and up and up. A core reason for that might be the perception of the need for confidentiality. But that doesn't mean that while balancing that, we don't still need more transparency. Yes, it's a market that users use, and it has some real advantages like that over the court service, and I suspect that's the driver. But having a product that has got some good features does not mean, as we've been trying to say, that we don't debate the bad features of it and try and improve those. That's where I'd come from on that.
My take on it, sorry, I can't. I'm constitutionally incapable of shutting up. But everybody who knows me knows that anyway. First of all, one answer is that obviously arbitration tends to be selected on the recommendation of arbitration lawyers. Second of all, and so, by us in the bubble. Second of all, it's a growth in the continuing growth in international commerce, where arbitration is very often, from an enforceability standpoint, a must-have, irrespective of quality. And third of all, the way we framed the debate was not that arbitration is bad. Right? I practice it almost exclusively, and I love it, and I think it's wonderful. Is it as good as it should be? Are we really asking the right systemic questions? And do we, and this again is certainly the beef that I have, do we as an arbitration community, and nobody else in the law calls itself a community, you don't get the M&A community, are we as a community really rooted in reality? And what annoys me most is this sense of self-importance that we all have, where I don't think as a community, we take enough good, long, hard looks in the mirror.
Any points on that from Philippa or Jean-François?
Look, all I'd say is that parties are perfectly capable of voting with their feet, and the feet are moving in the direction of arbitration. I think we do ourselves a disservice by spending our time decrying our own process. And whilst I completely agree that there is bad behavior out there, and there are some poor arbitrators out there who, one hopes will be, weeded out. And I would love to see a process on transparency that would actually work, and that is driven with the right information being collated. But the reality is, I think, Lucy Greenwood and Mike McElrath wrote an article about this some years ago, the sort of puppies or kittens approach, which said, if you go and ask an arbitrator how they perform or what they do or how they get through various issues, they'll always tell you it depends, because it depends on the case, it depends on the parties, it depends on the demands of the parties. And sometimes you can't do a good job as arbitrators because the parties string you up in a process that doesn't really work. And then they're the ones who are annoyed at the end of it. So, we all have an obligation to make it work better. We all have an obligation to keep soul searching, but that's what we do. And I don't think there is this self-satisfaction that Hendrik sees in us. We've all got a big ego, but none of us is ever the finished product. And if we are, that's the day we should retire.
Thank you. Jean-François?
No, sorry, I'm too depressed to answer because I've just found out about the results of the poll.
Yes. Well, unless the audience who are remaining, which there are quite a few attendees still around. So 45% of respondents said, and the poll has just come up again, said yes, arbitrators are getting away with too much. 32% no, and 22% firmly on the fence. So very interesting. I don't think that was how we expected the voting to go, but clearly there is some beef out there with our audience.
There's a whole bunch of litigators in there.
It is International Disputes Week, so it's not just arbitration. So it'll be it
might be that I employed the tactics I used as a union hack as a student and just packed the audience with my mates, couldn't it be?
Well, we were talking earlier about how there's very little empirical data and evidence. Like, someone needs to keep this result and use it because it is International Dispute Week. It is very interesting that the audience do feel that. Hendrik and I are shocked that we've carried the day. Sorry, Jean-François and Philippa. But actually, it's cheered me up enormously to hear people, because now we can carry on this debate and find some of the solutions. So great start to my day.
There were been lots of comments about regulation and self-regulation. Mention has been made of course, the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, which has a role in regulating its members. And Jonathan Wood made that point in the Q&A, so I thought that was worth mentioning there. And I know they have an ethics committee that looks at arbitrator behaviour. So it was worth putting that within the context of this debate.
But perhaps then also to contextualize that this debate was meant to be, it was meant to not be a restrained, measured, scholarly affair. It was meant to be a fist fight. Lest I never get an arbitrator appointment ever again. Neither Poonam nor I run around thinking this system is completely broken and we must get out of it. So perhaps to also put that into context.
Yes, there's a definitely a significant element of pantomime in today's event, and I'm sure that our audience appreciate that too. Let me come to you with a slightly different comment. Or does the panel agree that comparing arbitration litigation depends entirely on which court system one is comparing against? The English courts are impartial, technically competent, and fast, which may not be true of other courts, which I think is Jean-François touched upon the review role of courts in other jurisdictions, and how, yes, we may not have the balance always perfect under the Arbitration Act 1996, but alternative processes for set-aside proceedings in other jurisdictions may be much less ideal than what we have here. One thing, a good question from Gardner Leader, do you think lawyers are bringing all the issues you have beautifully set out today to their clients' attention when advising about whether to enter into arbitration agreements?
Well, I think that's one of the points I made, that do lawyers explain to their clients that, yes, they're getting confidentiality and finality, but actually explain what it means to arbitrate rather than litigate, and that the test is so much higher. And I've never advised it, but I mean, I'm a barrister, I don't know, and I've never heard of a solicitor explaining it all in detail.
Well, I mean, I think what I can say on that front is that, arbitration is very often a compromise choice in a commercial negotiation. Because neither party wants to go to the home courts of the other. And so arbitration is a kind of, not quite a fallback mechanism, but an alternative mechanism that they're choosing. Now, if you involve people who understand the arbitration process at that point, you get a better outcome, it seems to me, in terms of what parties understand of the choice that they're making. But, in my days in a full service firm, the reality was that you'd get called on to provide input on a clause at 5 to midnight when, the signing deadline was midnight. And, there was a limited amount that you could do to ensure the workability of the clause. So, that's a slightly, it's a wider problem, because it's down to us as litigators to, make sure that our corporate and commercial colleagues are well informed as to what they are advising the parties to enter into. But, the basics are there. And let's face it, at the time of entering into a contract, no parties ever think they're going to end up in dispute. They all love each other at that point. They're just waiting to get to the post-signing champagne as opposed to the post-conference champagne. I think there's a limit to how interested parties are at the outset. Frankly, I think there's a limit to how interested they are even when the dispute gets going in the first instance. That's
why the idea of a bespoke clause or whatever doesn't work. Parties are more concerned about the meat of the contract, not the dispute. Yeah. That's why the baseline, what the Act says, what the rules are, is so crucial, because that would be the position that's adopted.
But it'd be the same for a foreign party being dragged into a local national court. They might not necessarily know what they're signing up for. Let's say, if you knew you were going to be litigating in a jurisdiction where there was no or very limited disclosure as an English party, that would come as a shock, I think. So in all cases where parties are making a dispute resolution choice, they need to be well advised on that choice.
Absolutely. turning tack a little bit, George Eddings asked the question, the answer given to complaint equality of arbitrators is party autonomy to choose decent arbitrators. However, what if the respondent chooses a notoriously slow or busy or pedantic or whatever arbitrator? It's a good question.
Well, that comes back to two problems that were canvassed here. One, it's not that this debate blamed the arbitrators. It blamed a system which allows or sometimes forces the arbitrators to not do what they should do. Right? So, in terms of delay and so on, even if it's not a notoriously slow arbitrator, arbitrators on the whole tend to be much less willing to bang their hand on the table in terms of delays. And I have been guilty of that, sitting as an arbitrator. And I hope I'm not a bad arbitrator. So it's not an ad hominem attack against arbitrators, first of all. Second of all, and this scenario precisely points towards quite how toothless the supervisory system is, because in the current system, if the other side finds somebody who's notoriously slow, as long as they're not biased or don't speak the language of the arbitration, so could be gotten for lack of qualifications, there's just no way of dealing with that. You've got to live with it.
But I think in a panel of three situation, you can, I think, try as far as possible to encourage the chair to counterbalance the sort of efficiency concerns. Now, look, as I said earlier, I think in every arbitration, you're going to have one party that doesn't want the result ever and one party that wants it yesterday. So it's always going to be a balance between those issues. But at least in the institutional scenario, there is a measure of oversight as to how committed the arbitrators are. And I think there are, I think institutions find it very difficult. I've certainly heard the LCIA speak on it frequently, that, party choice is something that they feel it's difficult to go back to a party that says we definitely want arbitrator X, even though he's not going to be available for hearing for 3 years. I think it's very difficult for them to go back and say, we'd really rather you not, and I think that's, it's the benefit and the burden of party autonomy, because what happens if institutions start saying, no, you can't have arbitrator X because he's too busy and he's too slow, people aren't going to be happy about that either. So, I think, that is a systemic challenge, but it's one where I think, part of the drive for diversity has been to avoid the situation where you're limited to a pool of 5 arbitrators who understand the subject matter and for whom you have to wait.
What about it being a rule then that on the arbitrator that you shouldn't accept appointments unless you could do hearings or have availability that suits the seriousness of the case? Just throw it out there. So it's not that we're refusing the party, it's the arbitrator's own duty to refuse if they can't deal with it.
Sure, but I think there are issues there, because I think that is required by some of the institutions, that you verify that you have that necessary availability. But I think, much like hotels, arbitrators may oversell a little bit on the understanding that some of their cases will settle. And so, what initially doesn't look like an availability crunch becomes one. And that is difficult. And certainly last year, when a lot of hearings were postponed from the spring to a virtual process later in the year, I think we did get a pile-up of hearings all happening kind of in the second half of last year. And I'm sure it's had a knock-on effect on the production of the awards.
To maybe loop this point back to the point about advising on clauses, yet another reason why certainly I militantly advise against ad hoc arbitration, because it is true that institutions provide extremely valuable oversight. And I think the scope and quality of that oversight has increased. I've been in practice 12 years, has increased markedly in those 12 years, pretty much across the board.
I know that there were people who would respond to you, Hendrik, and say that ad hoc can work incredibly well with the right arbitrators. Usually, that's the key point, and counsel who understand the process and how it can be run properly. But yes, institutional oversight, of course, it can be incredibly valuable in many cases. But yeah, it can be much more challenging to do that. I'm conscious that we're at 10:13. I just want to pick up that maybe something that's been slightly lost in the debate a little bit, but one of the major advantages of arbitration is typically the ability to have a say in who is appointed to determine the dispute. And that's incredibly valuable in many cases because of the expertise of the panel. And you will not always get the expertise in a court in the same way. Yes, there are specialist judges who really, really know their stuff. But across the whole panoply of disputes that are out there, then getting someone with the necessary expertise, whether that's legal or sector specific, is so valuable in arbitration for clients. We are at 10:14. I think we could go all day, and we still have 85 attendees on the call, which is brilliant. But we're going to let people go because we don't want to impinge on any of the LIDW time that you may be having between now and the start of the first session of the day at 10:30. But thank you so much to the panelists for having fun with this, but also taking it very seriously at the same time and raising many interesting and thought-provoking ideas for discussion. The audience seems to have really engaged with this as a topic, so brilliant. And thank you so much, audience, for being so engaged and attending in the numbers that you have this morning. And enjoy the rest of today and the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Barry. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.